When you think about Muslim dress, certain images probably pop into your head right away, like a headscarf. But have you ever wondered if those images are shaped more by culture and later traditions, or by the foundational text itself, the Qur'an? Well, in this explainer, we're going to go straight to the source and see what we find. So let's just jump right in with the big question that gets to the absolute heart of this whole discussion. In the actual text of the Quran, does the word hijab mean headscarf? I think the answer is going to surprise you. Okay, so before we can even begin to talk about any rules or guidelines, we kind of have to become linguistic detectives. We need to figure out what these key Arabic words meant back then, at the time the Quran was being revealed, not what they might have evolved to mean centuries later. Let's start with this word aura. Now, in a lot of later discussions, this word is used to map out specific body parts that have to be covered. But if you look at the Quran itself, it's just not used that way. It's used to describe a house that's vulnerable to attack, or those times of day when you expect privacy in your home. So it's not a body part. It's a state of being vulnerable, or a moment of privacy. A totally different concept. And now for the big one, hijab. In our modern world, that word is basically synonymous with a headscarf. But in the Quran, its meaning is incredibly consistent, and it's something else entirely. The word literally means a partition, a barrier, a screen. It's actually not an article of clothing at all. Just look at how it's used. The word hijab appears in the Quran 7 times, and every single time it's a type of barrier. It's a physical partition for the Prophet's wives. It's the barrier that separates paradise and hell. It's a metaphorical barrier between people's hearts. It's the screen Maryam, or Mary, puts up for her seclusion. And it's even the veil from behind which God communicates. Do you see the pattern? In every case, it's a divider, a screen, a partition. Never once is it used to describe a woman's head covering. Okay, so if those keywords don't mean what many of us thought they meant, then what guiding principles for dress and just general conduct does the Quran actually give us? Let's dig into the core concepts. This verse right here, 7:26, is really the foundation for everything. It tells us that clothing has two physical jobs: one, to cover our private areas, and two, to be an adornment, something beautiful. But then right away, it introduces this higher level, saying that the clothing of righteousness, this inner God consciousness called taqwa, is what's truly best. This immediately shifts the whole focus from just the physical cloth to our internal spiritual state. So you can see this really clear hierarchy taking shape. Step 1 is the basic function, cover what's private. Step 2 is the aesthetic function, be an adornment. But the absolute peak, the most important garment you can possibly wear, is your inner consciousness, your piety. The physical clothing is the means, but the spiritual state is the ultimate goal. Now check this out, because the gender symmetry here is pretty striking. When the Quran gives its most direct advice on modest behavior in verses 24, 30, and 31, it starts with the men, and the core commands for both men and women are identical. Lower your gaze and guard your chastity. The responsibility is placed equally on everyone, and it starts with your behavior, not just your clothes. Then, the text gives a few specific instructions about clothing. It says not to show off your adornment except for what ordinarily appears, which is a really interesting phrase that seems to build in flexibility for context and culture. It tells women to draw a khimar, which just means a cover, any kind of cover, over their jiyub, their chest area, and to wear a jilbab or an outer garment when they're out in public for a very specific reason, to be recognized and protected from being bothered. It's all very functional, and it even offers flexibility for older women. All right, so now we've laid out the Quranic foundation, and this is where we get to the real core of our explainer. Let's compare these principles from the text to the very detailed rules that developed in later traditions. This table just lays it out so clearly. Let's take hijab. In the Quran, it's a barrier. In tradition, it becomes the mandatory headscarf. What about hair? The Quran doesn't explicitly mention it at all. In tradition, it becomes mandatory for all women to cover. The face? Well, the text actually says recognition is a goal, which would argue against covering it. But in some schools of thought, face covering is mandated. You see the pattern. The Quran specifies covering private areas and the chest. Tradition often gives you detailed lists, down to the wrists and ankles. And here's the real kicker, that last row. The source of authority shifts from the Quranic text itself to later sources like hadith and scholarly opinions. So what this all reveals isn't just a difference in some of the details. It really points to two fundamentally different approaches to the whole idea of religious dress. And that brings us to these two frameworks. On the one hand, you have the Quranic approach, which is principle-based. It's all about the why. It emphasizes that inner consciousness, taqwa, and provides these minimal, flexible guidelines with clear goals like protection. On the other hand, you have the traditional approach that developed over time. It's much more prescriptive. It's focused on the what and the how, legal compliance with detailed, uniform rules and measurements. And that leaves us with one final big question to really think about. If we take a step back and separate the core principles found directly in the Quranic text from the very detailed legal rulings that came later, how does that change our understanding of religious identity, of personal conviction, and of what it really means to dress with dignity and with faith?